The world was engulfed in the flame of the 7 Years' War. And then Year 7 came up and it ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Negotiations between the 10 major powers involved in the war were complicated. France, England, Portugal, and Spain had colonial properties all over the world. When England's coalition won, it meant ending the French control of North America. France ceded everything except for a couple of islands and fishing rights in a few places. The North American portion of this war was called the French and Indian War. If you were French, this was a brutal war. In New France, there were only 60,000 French settlers. This can be compared to the 13 British colonies that totaled 2 million residents. To try and even the odds, the French recruited the Mohawk, the Micmac, and the Iroquois nations to aid them. As the British Americans advanced north, the French settlers would continue to flee north. Acadia was the first to fall, which cut off any French reinforcements. The British forced all of the residents of Acadia out of the colony. They told them they could learn English and become British citizens, or head south to the French colony of Louisiana peacefully. This might seem like a long walk, but in the 18th century, Louisiana was a territory that extended from modern southern Manitoba to modern Louisiana. Those who arrived in Louisiana became known as the Cajun people. Those who remained in the colony became Acadians. British American forces were roughly halfway into French territory when the war had ended. Where they stopped is the dividing line between Upper and Lower Canada. The British had a bit of a problem. They had exercised their will on Acadia during the war. However, now they had the colony of Quebec, which had a northern half which was speaking French, and a southern half that was newly settled British Americans. Only a few years later, the American colonies, 2 million people strong, organized and began fighting a war for independence. As the American colonies pushed north to the modern US-Canadian border, the Loyalists began to flee. The outcome was not what people had expected. This resulted in a large number of American refugees. A large chunk of them, including British Loyalist Benedict Arnold, settled in New Brunswick. But a very large cluster arrived in Montreal, the French side of the colony of Quebec. The city became distinctly bilingual, with new residents learning the language of the land, and the people there learning English. To this day, Montreal still exists as a bilingual cultural capital of the country. In 1791, the region stopped being the colony of Quebec and became the colony of Canada. The colony of Canada was split off into a British half, called Upper Canada, and a French half called Lower Canada. The two colonies had separate legislatures, but in a single Governor-General. This meant that the British had to okay all decisions in the government. This would mean that no legislation would unfairly benefit one group over the other. The two groups maintained their own separate codes of law. By the end of the American Civil War, Upper Canada had a population of about 10,000 people and expanded fast. Lower Canada had a population of about 180,000 people. So now the big question, why is Upper Canada south of Lower Canada? Shouldn't it be the opposite? The names were given in respect to their position on the St. Lawrence River. Upper Canada was where the river began, or upriver. One of the first major actions of the decentralized government was to move its capital. The old capital was in Niagara, under the original name of Newark. This was very close to the border, and government buildings were burned down multiple times in the past. It was a problematic place for a capital. The capital was moved to York, or modern-day Toronto. This proved to be a smart move because in 1812, when war broke out with the Americans again, the Americans burnt down buildings in Newark, including the old government buildings. If it seemed like this wasn't a permanent solution, it was not. Constitutional talks for the independent colony broke down fast. In 1837, Lower Canada rebelled. Leading up to this, the Parti Patriote, led by Papineau, attempted to get accountability for corruption in the colony. Aristocrats were handling tax dollars for their family members. With no justice in sight, they served to have a rebellion, with a little bit of help from their American friends. Loyalist British forces quailed the rebellion and reinstalled the previous oligarchic government. The rebellion, however, spread to Upper Canada. The province was run by the Family Compact, a group of aristocrats who campaigned against responsible government, continuance with the British colony system, and against democracy. When William Lyon Mackenzie's Reform Party found corruption, and nothing was done about it, they rebelled. The message was clear. The people were not happy. A report was commissioned and carried out by Lord Durham. The Durham report was very damning of the aristocrats in Upper and Lower Canada. The report recommended responsible government. Soon after, all the parties collapsed as a new political unification of the two Canadas became present under the Union Act. Upper Canada became West Canada, and Lower Canada became East Canada. Under this new government, they implemented the double majority system. The government was run by the Governor-General. The Governor-General was appointed by Queen Victoria and had authority to make laws, appoint ministers, and effectively run the government himself. He, however, had to sign laws that were enacted by two separate legislatures, an English one from West Canada and a French one from East Canada. Essentially, to make change, you need to have an English-French partnership with a counterpart working on the same legislation in a different house. The new leaders of this twinned nation would be Robert Baldwin and Louis Hippolyte Lafontaine. They were only ever to pass one law. They decided to create municipalities and opted a way in which they could help fund them. With only 6 months, the government collapsed. Governor Metcalfe took over control of the government and began appointing Tories to key positions. This constitutional crisis went on for a year before finally an election was held. It was still not a stable relationship. With the British interfering, it was impossible to maintain this system. During the United Province of Canada era, the nation's capital moved 6 times. First it moved to Kingston. Then it moved to Montreal until protesters burned down the Parliament. Then it moved back to Toronto. And then to Quebec City. And then back to Toronto. And then back to Quebec City. Eventually, Queen Victoria intervened and decided the halfway point was Ottawa, and that Ottawa would be the capital of the nation. The main problem of the colony became that the legislature was ultimately useless. The Governor-General held all the power and could run the whole colony by himself. Even the old Family Compact was beginning to see the need for responsible government. Metcalfe was just an example of the problem. The governor was ordered to make sure the government didn't do anything too radical. It should also be said that Canada was no longer a small nation. If you recall, in 1763, there were only 60,000 people in Quebec. However, by 1860, there were now 1.4 million English-speaking people in West Canada and 1.1 million French-speaking people in East Canada. English people outnumbered French people. As a result of repression from the British, the Liberal Conservative coalition maintained majority in the legislature for well over a decade. Despite the policies enacted by the governor, they tended to be more in line with the opposition party, the Clear Grits and the Parti Rouge. George Brown of the opposition became one of the most prominent members of the legislature, despite never holding power. His signature was on the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement that would stand for 40 years. When John A. Macdonald became the head of the Liberal Conservatives, Brown surprised a lot of people by supporting his ambition for a confederation with the colonies of Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Prince Edward Island, and New Brunswick. Brown became a key player in attracting the French Canadians to the cause and was central in the decision to have a decentralized federal government. When East and West Canada dissolved in 1867, they became Ontario and Quebec. When the fathers of Confederation became the leaders of the country, locals took over governance of the two colonies. The first premier of the province of Quebec was Pierre-Joseph Olivier Chabot, the great-great-great-grandfather of Tom Mulcair.